Hi, this is Professor Makimura. This is the last lecture on the 19th century. We're going to talk very quickly, well, not quickly, but we're going to talk about Qing China and Meiji Japan, the transformations that these two countries would undergo in the 19th century. Okay, so let's start with Qing China. And that means we're going to talk with, we're going to do a screen share of my notes number 13. And here it is. Okay, so Qing China in around 1800. Qing China around 1800 is probably the largest country at the time. It has a population of over 100 million people, probably close to 200 million people, if not more. I mean, it's got at least 100 million people, probably 200 million or so. And by the end of the 19th century, by like 1900, the population would be at least 300 million. The only other country in the world that comes close or that rivals China is India. British India, towards the early 20th century, will have a population of roughly 300 million people as well. And if you wind back the clock to around 1800, it'll probably have a population of around 150 million people, just like, similar to China. The country next door, Japan, does not have a population that large, but Japan's population in 1800 is over 35 million people at least. It's probably around 40 million people. By 1900, that population has increased to something around 60 million people. Now, how large is this population? The population of France, for example, around the time of the French Revolution, is around 20 million people. The population of Britain around the time of the French Revolution is under 10 million people, probably around 8 million. So the population of Britain and France together rivals the population of Japan. Japan is not a small country in that sense. In terms of population, it is not small. The population of Southeast Asian countries is actually small in the 1800. It's got a very sparsely populated presence. The population of Africa as well is also small. It's very sparsely populated. And the population of the Middle East is not small, but it's nowhere near as large as India or China. The population of the Ottoman Empire, this one is really hard to guess. People make guesstimates. We know that in 1700 or so, not know, but we think that around 1700 or so, the population of the Ottoman Empire was probably around 30 million people. So believe it or not, the population of Japan is comparable to the population of the Ottoman Empire, and and is comparable to the population of 2 or 3 European countries. What happens is, with the advent of modern technology and with especially modern medicine, the population of Europe first and America just explodes and just jumps like crazy. So there you go. All right. So there's a reason why we're talking about these countries. So China. In 1800, China is a country that is run by a bureaucracy, an imperial bureaucracy. The dynasty is called the Qing dynasty, and it is a Manchu dynasty. The emperors are from the Manchu ethnicity. The imperial family is always a Manchu, and generally speaking, they marry other Manchu princesses. So they do not intermarry with ordinary Chinese, typically. Sometimes they do, but generally speaking, they try to find princesses from within the Manchu ethnicity. They speak Manchu, therefore, that's their language, but they are bilingual. They speak Manchu and they speak Chinese. The key reason why is because the population of the Manchus in the empire that is Qing China is probably around 1%. That's a very small number. The population who are Chinese ethnicity, the people that we associate today to be Chinese, Han Chinese, ethnically Chinese people, that's 90%. The other 9% are the other minorities. So there are other ethnic minorities running around in Qing, China. So they are the Mongols, they are the Tibetans, they are the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are the Muslims living in Central Asia. And there are other non-Chinese minorities living within, living south of the Great Wall. So you add all those populations up and you get somewhere around, 9% or so. So it's like, 90% Han Chinese, 1% Manchu. So the big question is, how do you rule this? And as I said before, the way they do this is by adopting diarchy. You have the civil service exams. The civil service exams are based on classical Confucianism. Well, actually, Neo-Confucian, but are based on Neo-Confucianism, not classical. They're all based on Neo-Confucianism. And among the Chinese population, the civil service exams are done in classical Chinese, and if you pass, you get to become government officials. Among the Manchu population, the exams are held in Manchu language, and if you pass, you get to become a government official. The government officials are roughly half-half. Half the government officials are Manchu, and half the government officials are Chinese. So what this means is that for the 90% who are Chinese, there is this road to participating within the Manchu government. And if you pass the civil service exams, then you can be a prime minister even at, whatever point. Actually, you can't be a prime minister because they abolished the role of prime minister in the Ming dynasty, and the Qing dynasty carried that on. So, but you can take the role of a minister. There are 6 major ministers in the Chinese system, and you can be one of those 6 ministers. It's not a problem. According to the system of diarchy, half the top posts are Chinese and half the top posts are Manchu. So out of the 6 ministers, 3 of them would be Chinese and 3 of them would be Manchu. And then 3 of the vice ministers would be Manchu and 3 of the vice ministers would be Chinese. So if, for example, the minister of war is Manchu, then the vice minister of war would be Chinese. And if the minister of rights is Chinese, then the vice minister of rights would be Manchu. So, that's how diarchy works. So it's based on this delicate balance. And the idea here is that because the Manchu emperor accepts Confucianism as a governing ideology or a governing religion, the majority of the Chinese people the majority of the Chinese bureaucrats, or the people who aspire to be Chinese bureaucrats, because they accept Confucianism, they accept the rule of the Manchu emperor. So the Manchu emperor is the emperor of China because he is the son of heaven who protects traditional Confucian values. In that sense, it's actually quite similar to the Ottoman Empire, although in the Ottoman Empire, the ratio of the Muslims and non-Muslims is a lot closer. And towards the end, the ratio of non-Muslims is much higher than the ratio of, the ratio of Muslims is higher than the ratio of non-Muslims. In a way, the Qing Empire is actually similar to the Mughal Empire as well, because the Mughals had a population that was roughly 20% Muslim, while the 80% of the population were Hindu, and yet the emperor was Muslim. So how does a Muslim empire rule over a population that's fundamentally non-Muslim, or 80% non-Muslim, 80% Hindu, right? Anyway, back to the topic. So the diarchy kept the system stable, and it kept the Qing dynasty in place, and the dynasty kept going from 1648 until 1911. The first major crack happens with the Opium War. The Opium War happens in 1839. And what happens is that the British, who have been selling opium to the Chinese from India, British India, basically, want to continue to sell opium, and the Chinese officials basically say, no, we don't want to buy your opium, and the war happens for this reason. Now, I could go with the Opium War and the details of the Opium War, but I'm just going to skip it all and just basically say that the Manchu Empire loses. The Chinese and the Manchus are forced to buy opium, forced to import opium. They have no choice. The British basically make opium effectively legal in the Qing Empire, even though before the Opium War, technically speaking, opium was illegal in the Qing Empire. And the Chinese are forced to sign a humiliating set of treaties called the unequal treaties. The two most important clauses in the unequal treaties is consular jurisdiction and the loss of tariff autonomy. And the reason why they're important is simple. So consular jurisdiction basically means that if you are British living in China, you do not have to follow Chinese law. You only have to follow British law. The law that you follow is the law that you used to follow back home. And the reason why this is important is because opium is legal in Britain. Opium is also legal in America. So if you're a British merchant or an American merchant, trying to sell goods in China and you want to sell opium, it's perfectly legal. You can do that. The loss of tariff autonomy is important because what this means is the Qing dynasty can no longer set tariff rates on their own. Tariff rates have now been negotiated by treaty. It has been set at 5%. It cannot be changed unless both sides agree. So seeing that opium is legal, what the Chinese government could have done is they could have said, all right, we're going to slap 1,000% tariff on the opium coming into China and make it so expensive that people don't want to buy it. Well, you can't do that because you just lost tariff autonomy. Tariff rates are now set at 5%, so the opium coming into China are now taxed at 5%, and they can't raise the price of opium any higher. So China then becomes a country that is flooded with opium over the course of the 19th century, and this is one of the reasons why the Chinese government realizes this. We need to reform. The other reason why they realize they need to reform is because they lose. The British, who have only a population of 8 million people, managed to conquer the world because they have India under their thumb, and the British can recruit soldiers from India. So a British Indian army is the army that helps Britain conquer the world on foot. And during the Opium War, a lot of the frontline troops fighting in China are actually Indian. They're actually not British. The ships are from Britain itself, and the ships are, steamships with cannons, and they blow Chinese ships to smithereens. And for this, the Chinese realize we need to reform. Now, here's the interesting thing. There are people in China saying we need to reform. So Lin Zexu, who is very important in fighting the Opium War. He is essentially the cause of the Opium War. He's the guy who says the British don't sell the opium to us. Lin Zexu says we need to reform. His secretary, probably the most important, is a fellow named Wei Yigeng. So Wei Yuan. Wei Yuan basically says we need to reform, and he writes books about this. He actually tries to translate, what's going on in the West and why they're strong. The sad part is the dynasty does not take heed. The government, in general, ignores the warning signs and says, it ain't that important. And they just leave it at that. Even though there are people saying we need to change, okay? All right, so here's what happens next. As opium floods into China, silver begins to leave China. There's now so much opium flowing into China that the Chinese can't pay the opium with enough tea that they produce. The tea that they produce in China for export is simply not enough for the opium that is being imported. And so silver that used to flow into China is now flowing out of China. So silver is beginning to leave China. When silver begins to leave China, what happens is that the ratio between silver and copper changes, right? I mean, silver is leaving China. Copper doesn't leave China, so there's less and less silver, so the price of silver goes up in relation to copper. And the problem is ordinary Chinese people live their daily lives with copper currency. But on tax day, they have to pay all their taxes in silver. So that means when tax day comes, they take their copper cash, copper coins, and they convert that to silver ingots, and they use that silver to pay their taxes. Well, when more and more silver leaves China, what happens is tax rates effectively go up, because even though the government didn't change the tax, if you need more copper to get the same amount of silver as before, well, then to get the same amount of silver, you're paying more copper. And so your taxes have effectively gone up. And this causes problems. Higher taxes makes people unhappy. And when you combine that with natural disasters, and people can't pay their taxes because of natural disasters, rebellions break out. And the largest rebellion that breaks out in China is the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion is the largest rebellion in human history. It is a rebellion that basically swallows almost all of southern China, from the Yangtze River region and below, and roughly 20 million people will die. There will be roughly 100 million casualties. It is the largest peasant rebellion in human history. And when this rebellion breaks out, the Qing dynasty realizes their old army, their old Manchu army, is not capable of putting down this rebellion. And when they realize that, they need to have a Western-style army, the Western-style army that defeated them in the First Opium War. Now, why is that the case? Well, that's because while the Taiping Rebellion is happening, the British and the French basically are so greedy that they say, hey, we can only sell opium in 5 ports. We actually want to sell opium in more ports. And when the Chinese say no to that, they go to war a second time. So this is called the Second Opium War, otherwise known as the Arrow War. And it happens smack in the middle of the Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864. Okay, so here it is, right? The Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864, Arrow War 1856, 1860. And when the Chinese lose the Arrow War, just like they lost the First Opium War, the Chinese, the Manchus say, we gotta reform. We gotta have a better army. And so the self-strengthening reforms happen. And the idea behind the self-strengthening reforms is this: Chinese learning for substance, Western learning for function. So the big idea here is that Chinese learning is Confucianism, and substance is the morality. The Western learning is the technology, the modern technology that the West has, and the function is the various arts of war. Does that make sense? So, in other words, what the Manchus and the educated Chinese are saying is that the morality of Confucianism is not wrong. Is that we only need to acquire Western weapons to be able to fight back. And once they actually start building these self-strengthening armies that are based on Western weaponry and Western drilling and Western technology, but are instilled with Confucian values, they go out and defeat the Taiping rebels. So this actually makes the dynasty think that, hey, this works, right? We can do this. And you can kind of understand why they say Western morality is BS, because, hey, when you got drug dealers selling drugs to you and the drug dealer says, I know we got better guns, but we also have a better morality. We also have a better system to govern our society. How many people are going to believe drug dealers, right? You can kind of understand that. So the Manchu leaders, the Chinese leaders who passed the civil service exams, all resist changing the Confucian system and stick with it and continue this self-strengthening reforms. This is, in effect, very similar to what Muhammad Ali did. Muhammad Ali didn't go out and say, hey, we need to adopt secularism. He probably continued to believe till his dying day that Islam was the correct religion. He just adopted Western technology. He adopted Western armies, fighting styles, and he adopted Western guns and cannons. So the same happens in China, right? And here I have why resist change, and I have 3 reasons. Well, I already covered success in overcoming the Taiping Rebellion. Here's the other 2. From the perspective of the Manchus, they could not suddenly say, yeah, Confucius doesn't work, so let's try something different. Let's try to import nationalism from Europe, or let's try and import capitalism from Europe. Ain't gonna fly. If you do that, then the 90% of the people will say, well, then why do we have a Manchu emperor? It's like, if you guys aren't going to believe what we believe, then why do we have a Manchu emperor? We want a Chinese emperor. Get out. And you can sort of see that there will be a Chinese rebellion. So that ain't going to work. Gentry. The people who pass the civil service exams are called the gentry, particularly the particularly the ethnic Chinese who pass the civil service exams are called the gentry. if you study the civil service exams for, say, 20 years, 25 years for your life, your young adult life, and you finally pass this really difficult exam and become one of the 300 every 3 years who pass the civil service exams, what? Are you going to suddenly go out and say, yeah, you know what, I spent my entire life studying this, but I think it's wrong? It's kind of hard. There's a reason why there's a lot of people who in China who are resistant to change. And so they keep the self-strengthening reforms and continue to say that their system is right and they only need to have Western guns. And they maintain this until 1894. And then in 1894-95, they fight against the Japanese. And they finally lose. When they lose against the Japanese, who have done even more thoroughgoing reforms, that's when the Chinese realize we need to change. The Chinese and the Manchus realize we need to change. And in 1898, the Manchu emperor, led by his advisor Kang Youwei, says, we got to reform, and runs the 100 Days Reform. But when he does the 100 Days Reform, his grandma or his great aunt, whichever, right? But the empress named as the Empress Dowager. So at one point, she was the emperor's mom. The Empress Dowager Qixi says, yeah, no, you're not going to do that. And basically throws the emperor into house arrest and quashes the 100 Days Reform. That's why it's called the 100 Days Reform. So, and returns, policy back to conservative, previous policies. But as soon as the 100 Days Reforms end, another thing breaks out, and that is the Boxer Rebellion. So the Boxer Rebellion is a rebellion that breaks out in 1898 and lasts until 1901. And what happened is that boxers, they're called boxers because they are Chinese martial artists, people who do Chinese kung fu. And the Westerners who were looking at people who did this kung fu thought that they were Chinese boxing. So that's why they're called boxers. Anyway, the boxers had two ideas. One is that if you practice this type of martial arts, that you'll be immune to bullets. Yes, and I know it's kind of insane, but they believe that. The other thing they believed is that they believe that all the problems that's ailing China is because of the foreigners. And this one is actually not that wrong. I mean, a lot of the problems that's befalling China is because of the foreigners. Because the foreigners constantly win the wars, every time China loses wars, Qing China must pay reparations. Each time they have to pay reparations, they have to get the money from somewhere, and that somewhere is the people. And so taxes go up. And because of the opium trade, as money flows out of China, as silver flows out of China, the price of silver goes up and it raises taxes and it makes people's lives miserable. So that part is actually kind of correct. So when a large-scale famine, once again, breaks out, the local people revolt, and when they revolt this time, they rely on the boxers. Now, initially, the Qing government says, we're going to actually crush the Boxer Rebellion, and they tried to put down the Boxer Rebellion. But eventually, the Boxers say, hey, if the dynasty is willing to work with us to get rid of the foreigners, we're willing to work with the dynasty. And at that point, Empress Qixi has to make a decision. Should she accept these rebels? Should she continue to treat these rebels as rebels and put them down? Or should she accept their olive branch and work with the Chinese rebels to get rid of the foreigners? And if you stop for a moment and think about this, if you have a population of 300 million people who's willing to fight for you to fight against the Westerners, and the number of Westerners in China is small, even though they might have a technological advantage, you kind of guess why Empress Dowager Qixi said, yeah, let's go with the boxers. And the dynasty then decides to switch its position, and instead of putting down the rebellion, decides to work with the boxers. And the dynasty then declares war on the foreigners to get out of China. The foreigners, the 8 allied countries, in this case, Russia, Japan, Britain, France, US, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, says, yeah, okay, if it's war, then it's war that you have. And an 8-nation allied force storms into Beijing and captures the Forbidden Palace, the palace where the emperor lives. Now the dynasty, well, it's the imperial family, runs away right before that happens, but the capital is taken over by the foreign armies, and when that happens, Empress Dowager Cixi realizes it's all over. And when it's over, she says, yeah, okay, I was wrong. The emperor in 1898 was right. We gotta do the reforms. And a last set of last-ditch reforms are put into place. And this happens from 1901 to 1910. The civil service exams are put to end in 1905. And a declaration to make a constitution is made in 1906. When the first new cabinet is appointed in 1910, it is known as the Prince's Cabinet. Out of the 10 ministerial positions, 8 of them are held by Manchu princes. Only 2 are held by Chinese. And when this happens, when the civil service exam is now gone, when the government posts are highly skewed towards the Manchus, the ordinary Chinese people say, why? This isn't our government. They don't represent us. They only represent the Manchus. And in 1911, a revolution breaks out. This is called the Nationalist Revolution. The revolution breaks out in 1911, and the Chinese people overthrow the dynasty. One province after another basically says, we're done. We're no longer going to obey the emperor. We are independent. And when that happens, the general who leads the largest army in China meets the rebels and says, hey, if you're willing to make me the new president of a new republic and end this system, then I'm willing to not fight against you guys. And when they agree, the dynasty collapses. And that's how the Qing dynasty ends. Now, to make this story a little bit, to push the story a little bit further, what happens is that this new guy, the general who leads the largest army in China, then betrays the revolutionaries and says, I want to be emperor. And when he declares himself emperor, the other Chinese say, what? We didn't sign up for this, and revolt against him. And ever since the Nationalist Revolution in 1911, all the way until 1949, China will be in turmoil. They will be fighting a civil war or another, or a major foreign war, a war against Japan from 1937 to 1945. So essentially a period of civil war from 1911 until 1936, and then a war against Japan from 1937 to 1945, and then a civil war from 1945 to 1949, until finally mainland China is unified by the communists. And that's how the that's where we'll take off next time. Okay. So, big important question. Why did the self-strengthening reforms fail? I think one reason is this. Because the civil service exams were still in place, I almost said self-service. No, because the civil service exams are still in place, even if you went to the West and got a Western-style education and learned all the important things that you need to learn, like math and science, and came back, you couldn't get a high-ranking government position. High-ranking government positions are reserved for people who passed the civil service exams. So that's one reason. People who understood Western technology, Western science could not advance no matter how much they knew. And that was bad. Another is that even if you can buy Western weapons, if you don't have an educational system geared towards Western science and Western education, then you can't keep up with scientific advances. And so the West will likely sell you weapons that are 1 generation old, but the West will always have the tip-top generation weapons. It's only second-rate stuff that they'll sell to China. And that's not good. And finally, the Qing government needed to modernize its government structure. It could not stick with the old system, but it did. As long as it stuck with the old system, they could not raise dramatically high taxes. And as long as they were losing many wars, as money drains out from the treasury to pay for the reparations, they had to, jack up taxes from the people, or to prevent rebellion, you had to lower taxes, meaning the government could not do major reforms even if it wanted to. Now, they do everything that, like, for example, the Egyptians and the Turks and everybody else did. You build railroads, telegraph lines, telephone lines later. Well, telephone lines not left, but telegraph lines, steamships, and all that kind of stuff. But it still wasn't enough. And finally, I think the main reason why you couldn't do this is because it was a multi-ethnic state, just like the Ottoman Empire. If you have a multi-ethnic state, it's really hard to get the people on your side and say, we're all in this together and we should pay higher taxes. The one way you can do that was nationalism. And that leads us to the last country, Japan. The reason why Japan succeeded. So share screen, Japan. The reason why Japan succeeded is because they understood that nationalism was the key. So here we go. I'm going to skip like the first half of the 19th century and go straight to 1868 or 1853, 1858. So by the 1800s, the system in Japan, the feudal system that had existed in Japan, the centralized feudalism, the system of alternate attendants, were beginning to cause severe stress on the samurai. The samurai could not raise enough taxes to maintain their lives, which meant that many samurai were deeply in debt and they were highly unhappy with their lives. The only problem is that as a samurai, you're supposed to be above monetary matters. You're supposed to be above money, some petty things like money, and you couldn't complain about money. But when Commodore Perry from the US comes to Japan, Commodore is a rank that's above captain and below admiral. So, it's a rank that no longer exists in the US Navy. But when Commodore Perry came to Japan and said, hey, you should open you should end your policy of seclusion and you should open relations with us, and the Tokugawa government decided to say yes to that in 1854 and decided to open relations with the US. Well, that is a political matter, and the unhappy samurai can now basically openly complain. And that is precisely what happens. From 1853 until 1868, there's a 15-year period where there's a strong power struggle inside Japan over what to do about foreign policy. Now, what ultimately happens is that the two domains, which is initially saying, hey, we should expel the barbarians and revere the emperor, switch sides after they defeat the Tokugawa government. So they use the slogan, revere the emperor and expel the barbarians, to overthrow the Tokugawa shogun. And once they overthrow the Tokugawa shogun, they create a government that is centered around the emperor. But once that happens, they flip on the earlier position of expel the barbarians and decide to open further to the West. This was highly unexpected. Many people at the time were surprised by this. But the reason why they did this is because the two domains, Satsuma domain and Choshu domain, had fought against Western powers and lost. And when that happened, they knew that reforms were necessary, and they knew that they couldn't keep the country closed. Militarily, they couldn't do so anymore. After all, that giant country, Qing China, lost the Opium War. So 1868 and onwards, this is the Meiji Restoration. They have an inkling. They're not stupid. They actually know, they have enough information already in 1868 of some of the changes that were necessary. One of the changes that's going to be necessary is that they have to get rid of feudalism. You can't have this old system as before. So they get rid of the feudal domains. They also get rid of the estate system, the feudal system that says the samurai are on top, then come the peasants, then come the artisans, then come the merchants. Span. And they get rid of that. And they say everybody is now equal before the law. Right? These are early changes that they know must happen. They need to do this because you need to actually get taxes from the ordinary people. Right? You can't rely on a feudal structure. You can't rely on a system where some people basically live their lives tax-free. Samurai, for example, don't have to pay taxes. That you can't do that. So all citizens are now legally equal, and in order to do the reforms, you need money. So in order to get the money, you have to reform the government. And that's precisely what they do. Okay, the other thing that happens, interestingly, is the Iwakura mission. Among the top leaders of the new Japanese government, half of them, roughly, that's in Japanese, get on a boat and they tour the world. So the Iwakura mission, about half the government leaders, really, leave the city of Yokohama, the major port at the time. They cross the Pacific, they land in San Francisco, then they cross America on the Transcontinental Railway. They come to Washington, D.C., then they go from Washington, D.C. to New York, and then from New York, they cross the Atlantic Ocean, they land in London, and then from London, they go to Paris, then they go to Berlin, to St. Petersburg, to Stockholm, they go to Vienna, I believe, they go to Rome, eventually they go to Rome, they go to Vienna, they eventually end up in Marseille, and then from Marseille, they cross the Mediterranean, they cross the Suez, the canal is not built, or actually no, the canal is already built at this point. They cross the Suez Canal, and then they cross from the Arabian Peninsula to India, and then from India, they go to Singapore, and then from Singapore, they go to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong, they go to Shanghai, and from Shanghai, they finally return to Yokohama. This is a 1.5 year journey around the world. And when the Iwakura mission goes around the world like this, they realize one thing that the other people around the world which were trying to do these reforms realize. They realize that the other people around the world which were trying to do this didn't realize. And that one thing is nationalism. In other words, when they travel around the world, everybody knew that, hey, you need to do all these things. You need to have all the technology that the West has. You need modern style military. You need to invite Western educators to Japan to teach the Japanese. You need to send Japanese students abroad. You need to build railroads. You need to build telegraph lines. You will eventually need to build telephone lines. You will need to build steamships. You will need to build factories. They knew all these things, but they also realized that, hey, we also need nationalism. Japan needs nationalism. So, big question. What is nationalism? And this is actually this is the chief members of the Iwakura mission. This is Iwakura Tomomi, this is Okubo Toshimichi, and this is Kido Takayoshi. Okubo Toshimichi and Kido Takayoshi are there are 3 top leaders in the Japanese government at the time, Saigo Takamori, Okubo Toshimichi, and Kido Takayoshi, and these are the 2 of the 3 top leaders. So that's how important this journey is. All right, so stop share and share screen back to my notes. Here it is. Okay, so here we are. They know that the thing that Japan needs to implement is not just the technological stuff. They also know that what Japan needs is nationalism. So what is nationalism? Here we go. Nationalism is invented by the French. The French Revolution invents nationalism. And the idea behind nationalism isn't, patriotism, more extreme form of patriotism. Okay. The idea behind nationalism is you take the idea behind patriotism, the natural sense that everybody has that you love your family, you love your neighborhood that you grew up in, you love your neighbors, you love your relatives, and you love the town that you grew up in, right? Patriotism is the love of the land that you grew up in, the land of your fathers. That's what patriotism means. What nationalism does is it takes that feeling that extends to your town or your village, or your city at most, and then you extend that to the entire country. All right. So, the reason why the French army before the revolution was, the French army before the French Revolution was an army loyal to the French king. The aristocrats are loyal to the French king. This is part of feudalism. And so the royal army in France before the revolution were staffed by French aristocrats. So the officers were loyal to the king. But the troops are fundamentally mercenaries. They fight for the king because they are being paid. And that's why before the French Revolution, you have things like the Swiss Guard, or you have things like the Wild Geese. So the Swiss Guards, as you can tell by the name, are Swiss mercenaries hired by the French king. The Wild Geese are Irish mercenaries hired by the French king. Right? You have German mercenaries hired by the French king. So mercenaries are hired by the king, and the mercenaries fight for the king. But the officers, and even in the French army itself, where a lot of the soldiers, the front line, the rank and file soldiers are typically, think like mercenaries as well. But what you do is you make those soldiers think, but when the French Revolution happens and the king's head is chopped off and the aristocrats flee the country, well, you have a problem, right? So the French Republican army after the revolution now has to raise a new type of army, and you have to make sure that these guys are loyal to the new republic. So what they do is they use propaganda, they use symbols, they use symbols like flags and songs. So most importantly is the national flag of France and the national anthem, the Marseillaise. So you use these symbols and flags and propaganda essentially to basically make people think that we're not Picardian, we are not Parisian, we're not Burgundian, we're not Gascon, but we are French. That we are all French, that we're all in this together. That your identity is not local anymore, but your identity is national. That's why you have two separate words, patriotism and nationalism. And if you watch the movie, Patriot, where Mel Gibson is fighting, the reason why Mel Gibson fights is because his family gets endangered in the Revolutionary War. As long as his family was not endangered, he had no interest in the Revolutionary War. But when his family got endangered, he said, I gotta get involved. That is the action of a patriot. This is the reason why you have the American Civil War, right? Before the American Civil War, a lot of people in America were loyal to their state. They were loyal to their locality. Robert E. Lee couldn't fight against Virginia, right? His loyalty did not extend to the Republic, the United States as a whole, but his loyalty was first to Virginia and then to the Republic. So that's exactly what happened here. And nationalism, the goal is to take that local identity and expand it to the national identity and transform people's identity so that they're no longer based on their local identity, but their national identity. Now, that's easier said than done. It's actually hard to actually get adults to change their minds. So what you actually really need to do is you need to mold young minds. This is key. And so what Japan does is instead of focusing on higher education from the beginning, because that's what you need, what they do is they focus on elementary school education first. Higher education does exist, but it's a systemized system. It's actually put towards the very tail end. So first thing you do is you build an elementary school education and you make this mandatory. Everybody has to go to school. And you set this up in 1872 for boys, and you set this up in 1886 for girls. So what happens when you graduate elementary school or grammar school? You go to middle school. So then Japan builds middle schools all over Japan. So once kids graduate middle school, what do you need? Well, you need high schools. So then you build high schools all over Japan. And then when you graduate high school, what do you need? You need college. And it's at that point in 1886, the University of Tokyo is built as a systematic Western-style higher education. Before that, the places of higher learning did exist. They needed this because they were inviting, Western professors to teach at Japanese higher education. But as a system, you had to wait until 1886 before the University of Tokyo and the other imperial universities are built. For women, in 1900, the first female national university, autonomous university, is built in 1900. The other way you get people to think like this is through conscription, is through the army and the navy. The French Revolution very rapidly got people to believe in the French nation because the French Republic used conscription. Young men had to join the army, whether they liked it or not. Same thing happens in Japan. Starting in 1871, conscription applies to the army and the navy. All young men must join the army and the navy. When they finish their service, then they're seen as full-fledged adults. But the point is, just like you have the Pledge of Allegiance in America today, in Japan, you had the imperial rescript. All the kids read the imperial rescript, the emperor's words on why education is important every day. It's actually very short. Just like the Pledge of Allegiance is very short. So you have these ceremonies, and you make everybody believe that, you're not Satsuma, you're not Choshu, you're not of a particular domain, but you are Japanese. And this is key, because unless people believe this, it's going to be hard for people to bear higher burdens. But once people believe this, they will bear higher burdens. All right, so what else can you do? If Britain has the Anglican Church, or not Britain, if England has the Anglican Church, and if Russia has the Russian Orthodox Church, and Rome has the Catholic Church, etc., well, then Japan is going to have state Shinto. You can't use Buddhism because Buddhism came from India, and you can't use Confucianism because Confucianism came from China, but Shinto is native to Japan, so you have state Shinto. The emperor is, after all, the head priest of the Shinto religion. So, it works. So you have all these, stuff, and you have, the national anthem and the flag and all those symbolisms. So you have all that, and you create a new nation, and nationalism comes to Japan. The crowning achievement for them is the Constitution. In 1889, the leaders who fought the Revolutionary War in 1868 to, the Meiji Restoration, to, get rid of the Tokugawa shogunate and place the emperor's government in charge. Well, it's really the government of Satsuma and Choshu. So Saigo Takamori is from Satsuma domain, Okubo Toshimichi is from Satsuma domain, and Kido Takayoshi is from Choshu domain. Instead of people thinking along these lines and getting only people from these two, or using these two domains as the key to run the entire country, let's see if you can get people from all over the country to participate in politics. And that is why the Constitution is created. So although Japan is not the first country in Asia to have a constitution, it is the second country and the first country to have a working constitution in Asia. Now, in the first election held in 1890, only 1% of the population could vote. But slowly, the right to vote increases, and by 1925, all men over the age of 25 could vote, and it is effectively a democracy in pre-war standards at this point. France, for example, women don't have the right to vote until after World War II. So in 1925, women don't have the right to vote as well. So all men over the age of 25 can now vote in Japan. They vote for a political party. The chief political party, or the political party that wins the most votes, gets to select the prime minister and the cabinet, and the prime minister and the cabinet then run the country with the final stamp being given by the emperor. The emperor has the right to advise, but the emperor does not have the right to coerce. The emperor has a lot of influence, yes, but the emperor does not have any legal rights to actually, tell the cabinet, do this, do that. But the emperor is the final commander-in-chief. So the emperor is seen kind of like, he's like the president in that sense. He is the head of the state. Okay, so those are the reforms that happens in Japan. So now we got to talk about, was this successful? Well, one, yes, the nationalism was successful. The first major war that Japan will fight in the modern period is the war against Qing China. This is called the Sino-Japanese War, the war 1894-95. By this point in time, Japan has a fully modern army and a navy that's been modernized along Western curriculum, Western science, and Western technology. More importantly, Japan has a nation. Japan is now a nation state. What does that mean? That means that the parliament in 1894, when the war breaks out, is asked, will you raise taxes? And the parliament says, yes. In 1894, I believe it was only 2% of the population that could vote. And every year from 1890 to 1894, for 4 years straight, the main thrust in Parliament was the taxes are too damn high. And yeah, the taxes are high because they're doing all these reforms. The government needs money. And every year the Parliament is saying in unanimity, the taxes are too damn high. And they're complaining to the government, which raise the taxes or keeps the taxes, saying lower the taxes. That's the chief and most vocal voice in Parliament. It doesn't happen because people know that, hey, the people in charge actually know that, hey, these things actually need to be done so that Japan actually needs to finish the reforms. But still, that doesn't change that, the major voice in Parliament is we need to lower taxes. Well, when the war happens, that 2%, which constantly said we need to lower taxes, flips around and says, no, Japan is our country. We are patriotic Japanese. We all believe in Japan. We need to raise taxes. And they flip around and they say, let's raise taxes. And when that happens, I think it shows you that, from the kids, from the young adults who are in the young soldiers who are in the Japanese army, to the politicians who are in the Japanese parliament, everybody basically now has accepted that, yes, we are a nation and we are all in this together. So this is one reason why the reforms in Japan is far more successful than in other countries around the world. Japan actually manages to transform its country through nationalism. And it turns out that the key is a conscription and education, not at the university level, but at the elementary school level. That was actually the key. Elementary school education is more expensive than university education, because if it's university education, you just need to build universities, like 3, 4, 5, 7, or whatever, various parts of the country, and you're done. If you do compulsory education, then you have to build grammar schools, elementary schools over the entire country. So that's why elementary school is more expensive, but Japan did it. So there you go. Okay, now there's actually another reason why Japan was successful, and this is economic. So the country that comes closest to Japan in terms of nationalism is probably Thailand and Ethiopia. And Thailand and Ethiopia, and Egypt too. These countries probably could have used nationalism, although Egypt is hard. I don't know how many of them felt that they were more Egyptian than Muslim. Their religious identity may have been larger, but regardless. Ethiopia and Thailand certainly could have adopted nationalism much earlier, and it could have raised money. But that alone wasn't going to be enough, although they didn't adopt nationalism and they didn't raise as much money. Here is what happened. So here, let me now show you a map of Japan. Map Japan. And there we go. Okay, we're going to talk about the economy very quickly. So there are 2 major ports in Japan. I mean, effectively only 2. One is Yokohama, which is right south of Tokyo. And the other one is Kobe, Kobe beef, which is right west of Osaka. 2 major ports, that's it, during this period from 1859 to 1899. Okay. And before Japan was opened up to Western trade, Japan was closed to the Western world and to the rest of the world. And in 1711, not only was Japan closed, Japan wouldn't even export gold and silver. After the 1700s, Japan would not export gold and silver, which means Japan had to make its own high quality silk, high quality cotton. Japan had to make its own porcelain. Japan had to make its own, what was the other one? Silk, porcelain, cotton. Oh, spices. Yeah, Japan couldn't make spices, so they made without spices. There you go. All right, so they had to make their own silk, and they had to make their own cotton, and they had to make their own porcelain. Well, here we go. When Japan, when the Iwakura mission and other Japanese, merchants and students go overseas, they see these Western factories. Remember, half of the Industrial Revolution is railroads and that kind of stuff, but the other half is the textile industry, chiefly the cotton spinning industry. But by 1800, this textile industry, cotton spinning and cotton cloth making has also expanded to include silk cloth making as well. So using machines to make silk cloth, using machines to make cotton cloth. This is the key. When these guys go overseas and bring that technology back, when these guys go overseas, what they see is, oh, we know how to make cotton. We know how to make silk. What these machines are doing is they're changing this part, which used to use human labor, and replacing it with machines to do that. So if we want to import machines, we don't need to import the whole shebang. We can know which is the most efficient way to import the technology. And so very quickly, instead of importing steam engines, the cutting edge stuff, the merchants and the producers who actually know this process bring back what's easily able to be localized. And the first machines that are brought to Japan, the first factories that are brought to Japan are water wheel powered factories. And that actually happens in Eastern Japan because Yokohama is the chief port. Kobe is the second port. And in this part of Japan, they are producing silk cloth. So instead of spending money and wasting it on things that you don't really know why you're doing this, these people know exactly what they're doing and why they're using these machines. So that's one reason, right? The other reason is once you actually know that, then the question is, how do you make the money? Here we go. Japan was very lucky. Starting in the 1860s, once Japan opens up, well, 1859, once Japan opens up, one of the main exports to the world was silk. Well, because of the Taiping Rebellion, the Chinese can't export silk. Silk is actually decimating the Chinese export market. So that means then the Japanese export market opened in 1859 suddenly becomes this new place where you can buy raw silk. And so Japan begins to export raw silk in large numbers. Initially, they're exporting raw silk to Europe, but starting in the 1870s, Japan begins to export large numbers of raw silk to America. And because America doesn't have anything to offer in return to Japan, America gives Japan gold or money. So the city of Yokohama becomes an export surplus city where they export more raw silk to America and they annotate where they export more raw silk to America and they import, whoops, undo, they import gold from America. So what happens then? The people who produce the raw silk here have extra gold. They have extra money. And with that extra gold, they pay people over here who's making cotton cloth with that money, gold. That money then goes over here where they're beginning to spin cotton threads. And then from Kobe, that money flows out. And it goes to India, where raw cotton is being produced. And from India comes, actually, let's not use that color. From India comes raw cotton from Kobe, and from Kobe to here, this entire region here, they make cotton cloth, and the cotton cloth then is shipped to here. What this means is that although Japan has a balanced trade overall, because the gold is coming in but also flowing out, although the balance is kept overall, there is a flow of money and an exchange of merchandise. In this part of Japan covered in yellow, they're building factories to produce raw silk. In this part of Japan covered in green, they're making factories to produce cotton cloth. And so this part of Japan develops through light industry. And then after the Sino-Japanese War, when Japan wins the war against China, Japan gets huge amounts of reparations from China. And in the city of Kitakyushu here, they build a massive steel plant, the Yahata Steelworks. And so what that means overall is that, let's use blue, this part of Japan develops industrially. And Japan is able to undergo an industrial revolution starting in the late 19th century, starting in the 1870s, going into the 1880s, 1890s, and continuing into the 1900s. And this is the reason why Japan becomes the first industrial country outside of the West, right? Which ought to make people ask questions. It's like, so India used to make cotton cloth, and India can make silk cloth. Why couldn't India industrialize? Well, the answer for that is because British government policy. The British government policy was to make India the purchaser of British cotton cloth. So British government is not going to encourage the introduction of industry in India. Now, just because the British government isn't going to encourage it, there will still be Indians who will build factories inside India because they think factories can make more money, and they're correct. And one of the early families that start to do this is Tata Industries. One of the first companies to build a power loom in Japan is Toyota. And the branch family from that Toyota eventually becomes Toyota Motor Company, right? So, the modern industrial world had its roots in the 19th century. What about China? China is a more difficult case. China in the 19th century was a producer of cotton cloth, and China in the 19th century was a producer of silk cloth and also porcelain as well. Why didn't China industrialize? And for me, the answer is because China was mired in civil war. The Taiping Rebellion was the largest peasant rebellion in human history. Then afterwards, China fights a series of foreign wars. China fights a war against France. When China fights the war against France, China is forced to relinquish Vietnam as its vassal state. China then fights a war against Japan. When China fights a war against Japan, China is forced to relinquish Korea as a vassal state. China then fights a war against the 8 allied powers. When that happens, they have to pay reparations to 8 countries. Because the Chinese are fighting all these foreign wars, whether they like it or not, and they have to pay reparations, money is flowing out of the country. And when money is flowing out of the country, it's kind of hard to do reforms and build massive, infrastructure projects because money is leaving your country. So I think that's the answer. This is the history of the 19th century world. Most part of the world have been colonized. And the idea behind most colonies is to make money. There are exceptional places like Taiwan, Korea, and Philippines where the goal is to assimilate the local people and make them like the home country. And there, what happens instead is money flows into the colonies to actually, raise the living standards in the colonies, and it does. But the culture is, is being transformed. In the most colonies, the culture basically remains intact because the colonial powers don't care. The colonial powers are just siphoning money out of those places. Which one's better, which one's worse, I cannot decide. That's for you, each individual to decide. All right. And then there are countries that try to do reform. So, you have from west to east, you have Egypt, Ottoman Empire, Ethiopia, Thailand, China, and Japan, right? All these countries try to do major reforms. Some were successful, some were unsuccessful. The Tanzimat reforms in China, the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire and the self-strengthening reforms in China were failures. And there, I can't really fault the failures too much because, regardless of the economics, the political situation just was too hostile. They were not nation states. They could not be nation states. And even if they wanted to transform and do all those economic changes, well, in the case of China, as I said earlier, because they lost all these wars, it was kind of hard. In places where they could have done nationalism, like Ethiopia, Siam, or Thailand and Japan, they were more successful. But only in Japan was the Industrial Revolution possible. And that happened because of what I just explained to you, because there's flow of goods and flow of money. So that's it for this lecture. And I will then upload the 20th century next. All right, so let me stop the recording. Have a good one.